Well, hello there. We're back, and welcome to the Charlie and Linda Show, otherwise known as Bloom Talks, Facebook Live. And it's good to be here, good to be back, and to be starting on time. Some of you may have noticed that we ran into some technical difficulties the last couple of times we've done this, and we got started late, but looks like we've handled them. Today, we are going to talk about the key, or actually it's one of the main keys to trust building. And as probably most of you are aware, trust is a foundational quality for all good or great relationships. Without trust, you ain't got nothing.
Nothing but trouble.
Yeah, you do have something, but it's not what you really want. So we're going to be talking about that, and just to say a little bit about what that is. It really has to do with, not surprisingly, communication. You know, so many people say, well, communication is so important in relationships, which of course it is, but when we think about communication, we generally think about one of the two sides of communication, which has to do with speaking. And we may forget that the other half of communication, listening, is equally important, sometimes even more important, because if we're saying all the right stuff, but the person to whom we're speaking isn't available to really absorb that, to take it in, then we don't have an exchange. There's no mutuality. There's no reciprocal exchange there. So communication really has to do with an exchange, not just of factual information, but an exchange of experiential information. In relationships, when we talk about communication, we're really looking at how are the words that are being transmitted between us affecting what we're experiencing with each other. And the way in which we do that has a huge impact on how much trust we have of each other. Trust is a very general term that can refer to a lot of different aspects. We can trust somebody to be honest with us, or not. We can trust that they understand and have an intention to understand what we're experiencing. We can trust that they care. We can trust that they have forgiven us if we've apologized for something. But if there's no trust, then we don't really know what we can count on from each other. So the quality of listening is actually one of the most important aspects of creating a trustworthy relationship. Wouldn't you say?
I would say so. I don't want to diminish the importance of many of the other factors that are so relevant and profoundly important in building trust, like being honest, not keeping secrets, being a person of integrity, being committed, showing the person that they are count-onable, and also about not making agreements unless we can really keep them. These are all foundational in building trust. And I think that these are the more obvious and blatant trust building foundational cornerstones. What is a little more subtle and sometimes overlooked is the climate of the relationship, the way in which we create safety in the relationship that makes the trust really and truly strong. And so when Charlie's talking about committed listening, we are emphasizing how essential and important being a courageous listener, being a patient, self-disciplined listener, particularly when our partner is bringing material to us that activates strong feelings in us. And we both feel so strongly about how foundational listening is. We've already done a piece in the first series when we were talking about going for the gold, about being a black belt listener, that I thought it was really important to do another piece on listening and the way trust rises when we work with our own reactivity. Because there's something instinctual about when somebody kicks us, we want to kick them back. When somebody hits us, we want to hit them back. But we learn as we're socialized to not be physically violent.
Some of us do.
Some of us do. A lot of us do. But we don't hold the same standard of harmlessness for our verbal violence. And some people have grown up in family where there were the Bickersons and everybody threw their judgments and their criticism around, and they're just the fish in the water. They don't know any better. This is just how they speak. We both came from families who did a lot of that. And so we had to learn the hard way that we were wounding each other and that it is a form of violence. Verbal violence is aggressive. And sometimes people they're loath to let down that kind of judgmental, critical way of being that's so aggressive because they think that not to do that, they're going passive and that they're going to be stomped on, taken advantage of, exploited, walked over, treated like a doormat. And we are not encouraging that in any way. We're not encouraging being passive. We're encouraging changing the aggression that can come out in the way we speak with each other to being assertive. It's a very proactive way of being, but it isn't necessarily our first response. The intuitive response may be, I'm going to get him back. Like the wolf comes into the pack and bars their teeth. She's showing I'm not to be messed with. We're saying we don't necessarily have to bar our teeth, that we can be vulnerable and show our neck. I don't want to harm you. I want to be connected with you. I want to be together with you. I want to play team with you. And that's a very assertive, empowered position. It's certainly not passive, but we have to have our creative thinking working for us, engage neocortex, because the more primitive part of the brain wants to get them before they get us, or get them back when we perceive threat. So this requires really paying attention to our own experience, which is not the first response either. Usually, when we feel threat, the instinct is there. The self-preservation instinct is we have our attention on the threat out there. So we're inviting you to bring your attention back to yourself and your own experience, your deeper feeling experience and needs, and to assert those and speak in your own behalf about what you're experiencing in that moment and what you're needing in that moment.
So it's a great theory, and it definitely works most of the time if you can apply it, but that's a big if. To bar your most vulnerable aspects, to bar your unprotected neck to the wolves who, or the wolf who is gnashing his teeth at you, is anything but passive. It requires a very strong, committed effort to resist the temptation to react defensively. Some people would say it's foolish. Some people would say that it's irresponsible not to fight back. It's putting yourself in a position in which you could really be harmed. And in fact, that is the definition of vulnerability. We're talking about being vulnerable here. If you look the word up in the dictionary, what it would say is to be vulnerable is to be undefended. It's to be at risk of being harmed or injured. Mm-hmm. And that's really what the alternative to defensive reactivity is. When somebody is coming at us verbally with accusations, with insults, with condemnation, with judgments, in ways that cause us to feel disrespected or attacked, it's hardwired into us to react in ways that are either verbally or physically or emotionally defensive. And it makes sense because, if our ancestors were to drop all of their defenses in the face of threat from other humans or animals, we wouldn't be here today. So there's something to be said about that defense. It's necessary. However, the purpose of relationships, particularly close primary or intimate relationships, is not to be on guard and be defensive, but to be able to cooperate with each other and to be able to provide mutual support to each other. So it's although it's counterintuitive to drop our tendency towards reactivity, it's what is necessary in order to deepen trust and respect in an important relationship.
And I want to give you some more examples because we're trying to get to the subtleties and why we're in pain and not thriving in our relationships. It's more obvious when it's coming in the form of an attack, a verbal attack, a threat, an ultimatum, judgment, criticism, controlling, directive, bossy statements, demands, commands. We can notice quite easily, man, I got triggered when you just said that to me. I feel like you're being controlling. I got triggered when you said that critical remark about me and you said that that was stupid, or you said that I was careless. Those can be easier to get our hands on, that we need to pause and reflect and think about how we're going to respond. Sometimes we get triggered and it's not so obvious. It can be hidden. I'm willing to give myself as an example. I got a big hot button about being ignored. I came into this relationship with it before I ever laid eyes on Charlie. I had a hot button about being ignored. And for some of us, that can be even more painful than being judged or criticized. And so if I notice that I don't feel valued, I don't feel appreciated, I don't feel seen or heard or understood or honored, and I've got perturbation going on inside me, instead of going on the attack the way I used to many years ago and saying, what's wrong with you? You neglect me, you're cold, you're selfish, you're hard-hearted, those kinds of things, where I would retaliate out of my reactivity of feeling hurt. To know what's going on with me and to responsibly report out about feeling hurt or neglected or lonely, and naming my longing for connection. Because Charlie's a very self-contained system, and he could go for longer periods of time thriving and happy, but I need a lot of connection to thrive. No judgment, just different. But I didn't always have my hands on what it was that I was so upset about. It took some time and some inner looking for me to recognize what my triggers were, and then to learn how to responsibly speak up in my own behalf without a scolding tone in my voice and an accusatory way of bringing it to his attention. And what I want to assure you that I have learned over my many years of the work that we've done on our own relationship and our 4 decades plus working with couples in classes and counseling, aggression invites aggression. Judgment invites judgment. Criticism invites criticism. Attack and defend invites attack and defend. And vulnerability invites vulnerability. And if we can take that pause to get in touch with our deeper, tender feelings, it's not a guarantee that when we bring that to our partner, that that's going to make a connection heart to heart. But it sure increases the chances that that deep listening to our own inner experience and our reporting out about that will catalyze their deep listening to their own tender feelings, and that they can bring it to us. And those kinds of communications are way easier to listen to.
Yeah, I really like the way you made the connection between listening to our own experience, redirecting the focus of our attention from that other person who's posing a threat to us in this moment, and redirecting it back to myself to see, well, what's going on with me? Because when I'm triggered, and triggered really means when I'm feeling threatened, when some strong emotion is possessing me, it prevents me from really putting my attention on myself. I'm not aware of what I'm experiencing, because when I'm feeling threatened, it's a natural instinct to direct my attention to the source of my perceived threat, because that's the way I need that information. I need to know what they're doing, what they're saying, how they're standing. I need to pick up the cues that tells me how dangerous this situation is. And so I'm naturally unable to really self-reflect, because it feels too dangerous. I feel too vulnerable when I take my eye off the ball, when I take my eye off of them and put it on myself. And so I feel more secure when I'm doing that. And I feel even more secure if I'm in an attack mode with them, because that makes me feel more like I'm disabling them, or I have the potential to disable the threat that they're posing to me.
But when you win at that game, you lose.
Yeah, well, if I was facing an enemy, somebody who I did not trust to be concerned about my well-being, or who was willing to violate me in some way in order to get something that they wanted from me, then that would be a reasonable thing to do. But when I turn my partner into an enemy, and she becomes an enemy when I begin to perceive her as a threat to me. So this whole notion of being able to listen non-defensively, that is, to hear what this person is saying to me, even though it might trigger strong feelings in me and make me feel at risk or threatened in some way, the challenge of dropping my defenses under those circumstances is big. Mm-hmm. We don't want to, kid you or anybody into thinking that this is, anybody should be able to do this. It's taken both of us quite a long time to overcome the natural tendency to be defensive in the face of aggression, or in the face of hurtful things that are coming from the other person, when the situation in our relationship has deteriorated to the point where we're really operating more from a very primitive instinct rather than engaging, like Linda said, the neocortex, which is more able to process information in more productive ways. So this is not easy, but it's doable.
Mm-hmm. The first step is you have to catch yourself red-handed doing the aggressive, the judgmental, the critical, the threats, because some people have been doing it for so long and those patterns have been in the family for generations that they don't even notice that that's one of the reasons that they're suffering. Years ago, we worked with a couple. We call them Jules and Sue. Their names are disguised to protect their confidentiality. But when they first came to see us, they knew that they were in pain. They knew that they were in suffering. They knew that their relationship was in trouble, but they couldn't put their hands on what was the matter. And it just took us 5 or 10 minutes to see that they were speaking in judgments. And that was commonplace for them. They hadn't really seen from their models in their family that a responsible way to talk, that it was an irresponsible way to talk, that it was a sloppy way of talk, and it was a trust busting way to speak with each other. So they didn't have much safety. They were armed to the hilt, and they were constantly in reactivity with each other. I could talk about us back in the old days when we were reaction machines during the time that we were stressed, that we talk about in our new book, That Which Doesn't Kill Us. And we would see that we were such stress cases that even though we had had a period of time when we were cleaning up, we were so distraught that we were dry tinder and we would burst into flames and we would deteriorate and regress into old patterns that we had successfully come past to a degree, and we were challenged even in the midst of the stress to take those pauses and reflect, small ones, not days. Hours is even long. Small pauses to get our center back, to get our groundedness back, to soothe ourselves, to take good care of ourselves so we can go and have another conversation that would be constructive. And I want to recommend a book. This is the best one that I have been able to find about the pause that refreshes. It's by our dear friend Susan Campbell, who's also a therapist and a workshop leader and a writer. And her book is called The 5-Minute Relationship Repair. Now, doesn't that sound like it's going to be easy to do, just 5 minutes? But she does say in the book that it takes thousands of repetitions to get good at it. So it only takes a brief pause, but you have to do it many times till you establish a new normal.
I think what might be a good idea for us, Linda, is to just mention some of the things, some examples of things that we may get triggered by, that in the heat of an argument, our partner may say to us, or that we may say, and then maybe give some examples of how we can, if we're on the receiving end of some of those attacks, what feels like an attack, how we can respond to that in ways that don't inflame the situation.
That's a good idea. And one comes to mind for me. You don't even have to be blatantly criticized with anybody saying, well, that's a stupid remark, or how could you do such a thing? Sometimes it's more subtle, like going to a movie and one person loves the movie and it leaves the other person cold. And so they come out of the film and one person says, boy, that was boring. And the other person say, how could you say that? That really touched me. That it can be threatening just to have a difference. And that's healthy individuation.
Sometimes you don't even have to say anything. You can just roll your eyes.
Yeah. And
that in
people
itself
can be triggered by that as, oh my God, he's judging me for having a different experience, or she's judging me for having a different experience. And that couple is not individuated enough so that they really feel self-assured that they can have their own feelings, they can have their own take, they can have, a very positive experience when the other person is not, and that's okay. There's a big enough space for it all to peacefully coexist. But if you end up feeling that your experience is maybe being judged by the other person, to check it out, because maybe they're not judging you. Maybe it's your own fear that's triggering you and making you have the reactivity. So having a calm discussion about what came up.
So bringing curiosity rather than antagonism or anger to a person from whom you're experiencing receiving a disagreement or a negative reaction.
Or just a different experience.
That can be very helpful. So just say, oh, okay, well, how is it that you see it that way? Like, what is it that makes you feel that way? Mm-hmm. Without any, judgment, although it's not uncommon to feel like the way I see things is the way any rational, normal, mentally healthy person would see it. So anybody who sees it any differently than I do, man, they must be really messed up, because if they, had their head screwed on straight, they would see it exactly the way I do. And
that's inflated self-esteem. Now, the people with the deflated self-esteem might go to, oh, I'm bad and wrong and I'm not seeing it correctly.
Yeah.
But it's painful. It's painful not to be held with positive regard. All of us want to be valued. All of us want to be honored. All of us want to have respect. And so the differences, even the subtle differences, just different takes on things, can sometimes trigger us. And so I'm totally with Charlie about bringing the attitude of curiosity and wonder and making a big space for the differences to be there, and to, say, well, maybe there's something for me to learn that would embellish my life, that would enrich my life, seeing it through another set of eyes. And nobody's wrong. It's not about right and wrong. It's not about good and bad. It's just about different.
Usually, I will say probably almost all the time, but I'll just say usually, what's below the defensiveness or the reactivity that comes up is fear. Fear that our different perspectives could be divisive in the relationship. Fear that this could mean that we're drifting apart, that we're not on the same page. Mm-hmm. Fear that our connection could be jeopardized. Fear that you may be trying to control me. Fear that I may not stand up for myself in this. Fear that this could turn into something really damaging and ugly. And that's where the vulnerability comes in. It's the willingness on whoever it is that is conscious enough at the time, because both the person who's being aggressive or attacking and the person who's on the receiving end, both people at that time are being driven and motivated by fear. And so it only takes one person to shift from that level of defensiveness to drop down into vulnerability, mm-hmm. and say something about what they are experiencing, such that they are responding the way they are. So one of the ways that an example of what somebody could do or say in a situation like that, where they've just put out let's say they put out a thought or opinion or a desire, and the other person has reacted to that with strong disagreement or anger, or in some ways punitively. Mm-hmm. That an example of a non-defensive reaction. It doesn't mean that a reaction doesn't mean that I'm not feeling something inside, but it means I'm not projecting my reaction outwardly on the other person. So it could be something along the lines of, when you said that, this is what it made me feel. And I really want to be able to, I want you to understand, mm-hmm. what effect that had on me, to give them some feedback, which, by the way, is the title for our next talk next week. So that's a little segue into next week. We're going to be talking, the title is, Can I Give You Some Feedback? Mm-hmm. And we're going to be talking about what feedback really is and what it's not.
And I just want to give you a heads up that our book, That Which Doesn't Kill Us, How One Couple Became Stronger, the Broken Places, clearly illustrates with a lot of detail when we did it badly and we were critical and triggered and acting out all over the place, contrasted with when we learned how to do it better. So there's a book that could really support you. And I also want to announce Multiversity. We're teaching there this weekend. There's still space available. Anybody wants to jump in last minute, starts tomorrow.
Get all the information on our website, bloomwork.com.
We'll see you next week. Looking forward to seeing you then.
Adios.
Bye-bye.
Oh. You want to reach for it.
Okay.